going to introduce Mike Lynes. He's currently the policy director for the Audubon in California, based in Sacramento. And he has previously held several positions working in ways of supporting environmental groups. He's been a biologist. He's been a lawyer, attended law school, and then supported representing nonprofit environmental groups. Then he held two positions at the Golden Gate Audubon, which is based here in Berkeley, as the conservation director and then as the executive director. As I said, he's currently now the director for Audubon in California. And I just wanted to note that I have quite a few emails from Mike in my saved environmental emails box, which I appreciate. And we want to thank you very much. And we're looking forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Should I go ahead and take it from there?
Yes, please.
Sure. Thanks. And thanks for having me. And Carol was reminding me that I gave a presentation to the League several years ago talking about the Altamont wind pass or wind resource area. And it's interesting because even though I'm now at the state office for National Audubon, I'm still working on the Altamont and working to resolve some issues with wind turbines and impacts on birds there. And that I could give you a whole other presentation sometime on wind power, solar power, and birds. And if we have actually some questions, we'll have time for that. And I'll be touching a little bit on renewable energy as I talk about the 30 by 30 initiative today. A couple things just before, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in a moment, and I've got a presentation. I'm going to step through some slides, talk a little bit about the subject matter. As I think Carol mentioned, feel free to interrupt me and ask a question. Ask me to pause if I'm going too fast or if you can't hear me. And I won't be able to see if you put anything into the chat while I'm sharing my screen, but I know that folks will call my attention to it if you happen to put something in there. And then I will be making reference to some reports and some websites and some other resources through the course of the presentation. I don't have links in my slides themselves, but if you're wanting everything, you can Google easily. But if you have things that you want, that you would like, more resources for, you can email me, and I'm happy to share my growing bibliography of resources on the 30 by 30 initiative. So I just wanted to invite you to first interrupt me, and also just be aware if there's information you want, I'm always happy to provide more information afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And every once in a while, by the way, I'm working from home. You may hear my children who are 9 and 12, or my wife and my children trying to control our 9-week-old puppy, who just minutes before this presentation had an accident on our bed. It was our first time she's done it. And so we've really welcomed her into our home now that she's made accidents on our bed. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Okay. So can everybody see that okay? Or can anybody not? Great. And I'll just start. A lot of the pictures I'm going to show you tonight, they come from a diversity of resources, but one like this actually comes from our folks that work at Debs Park. And Audubon has a center in East Los Angeles at the Debs Park. And it's really kind of ground zero for talking about how Audubon, at least, and I think a lot of other conservation organizations are starting to think like this, really want to be explicit about how we're connecting the benefits of conservation and nature to birds, birds to people, and talking about nature and nature where they live, and really providing the benefits of nature for everybody. And I'm going to get a little more explicit about that, but as I step through the presentation, but I wanted to center us with this sort of juxtaposition here. Folks, I think this is a kayaking trip that the Debs Park team did with kids from the community, many of whom don't have ready access to nature. And for many of us, that's a luxury that we take for granted oftentimes. And even I used to live in Berkeley, being able to just go down to the Berkeley Marina or up into East Bay Hills. When I was at Golden Gate Audubon, we ran a program for connecting kids in different schools in Richmond, Oakland, and San Francisco. And many of those kids grew up 3 miles away from the bay, but had never actually been to the bay before. And so, and had been, frankly, excluded from enjoying nature in many different ways. And organizations like Audubon have perpetuated those kind of exclusions. And 30 by 30 is one of the opportunities for us to start dismantling some of the kind of ways we've excluded people from the benefits of nature. And so again, I want to focus this, even though Audubon's a bird organization known for that this is really about connecting people with nature. And before I kind of step into the rest of my thing, I have to just sort of acknowledge the moment that we're in. And I don't know if you all were like me over the last week, but I did a lot of staring at a map of red and blue. This is now, depending on your political persuasion, been filled in a little more with blue, and there's resolution. But this is certainly how I felt for much of the last week. I'm going to talk a little bit about my view on the transition and where Audubon's going to engage. And it does reflect on the discussion around 30 by 30. But I wanted to just take a moment first to acknowledge, I think maybe many of us are in a headspace where we're still a little exhausted and a little reeling. And now we're starting to look forward to the work we have ahead of us. And so thank you for humoring me. So here's the agenda for the evening. I'm going to provide an overview and a definition of 30 by 30. So what is that? What does that even mean? It's so jargony. And then I'm going to bring it home to talk about how California is starting to look at the issue. I'll talk a little bit about Audubon California's engagement and our set of principles around this. And hopefully when I talk about our engagement and our principles, I think that's what we see as hopefully it can be illustrative of how different organizations, whether it's the League or other organizations you're engaged with, might connect with the overall effort. That includes what we've identified for Audubon, at least some opportunities in the state to advance the agenda around this. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. And the discussion may range maybe 30 by 30, but it may be anything else that comes to mind. So just some background on what I mean when I talk about 30 by 30. And you can see from the definition here, but it's the protection of 30% of nature, of land, of the Earth's lands and waters in order to protect its biodiversity by 2030. And it's seen as a stepping stone to get to 50% protection at some point in the future. And that 50% protection, as ambitious as it sounds, E.O. Wilson, a famed ecologist, is credited with popularizing this notion, but he's certainly not the only one. Hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists have signed on to this notion that we need to protect that much of nature in order to protect our basic ecosystem functions throughout the world, in order to keep climate change in check, in order to, try to make sure that the global temperatures do not go above 1.5, do not increase above 1.5 degrees Celsius. We have to be making this kind of sizable investment into nature. The HE biodiversity targets from 2011 came out of an international effort to set by 2020 a 17% protection of land and a 10% protection of water. And we actually globally made pretty good progress towards those, though to be fair, a lot of those protections were already in place. So, and I want to also say, when we talk about 30 by 30, I'm not talking about that today in 2020, we're starting from zero protection. I'll get to a little bit of this in a moment, but it's really additive onto where we're already at. So I'll give you some specifics. The 30 by 30 sort of jargon and really, I guess, the sort of legitimacy around the approach took a big step forward in the zero draft post-2020 framework for the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And so again, an international effort where they're coming together and deciding how are we going to tackle the major global environmental challenges. And so that's the zero draft. And it was really to lay a groundwork for a UN biodiversity summit that originally was going to happen last month in October, and now has been delayed a year because of COVID. That was going to take place in China. And the idea was that there would be a biodiversity accord that would parallel the global climate accords to reduce emissions. So the idea here on a global scale is to elevate the concerns around biodiversity and the commitments that nations would make to protections, to elevate those in the public and political consciousness to be at the same level of what we talk about when we talk about climate change. And then, of course, the two things are inextricably linked. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about natural and working lands climate solutions. But the loss of biodiversity that we're experiencing globally is staggering. And there's large scale loss. You've probably heard of this, of forests across the globe, pollutions and the compromised marine environments, and we're losing fisheries and all sorts of other functions that come from the oceans. And so there really is this very significant decline in nature, and a realization that if we don't start controlling for the loss of biodiversity, we will see really millions of species go extinct over the next several decades. And there's sort of a cascade effect. Once ecosystems start to break down, there's a tipping point at which you cannot return, or at least it takes millennia for the ecosystem to come back into balance. And that's what we're really trying to struggle with. I'm not going to talk a lot about the national effort around 30 by 30 right now. I'll just say that there is Senator Udall, who is now being named as a front runner to be Joe Biden's Secretary of the Interior. So the Department of Interior at the federal level, they run the Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, sort of all the wildlife and natural resources elements for the country. Tom Udall, Senator, is likely to be the next Secretary of the Interior. And he introduced Senate Resolution 372, which would make it the policy of the nation to implement 30 by 30 on a nationwide scale. And so you can look up S372 Udall and kind of see some very good summaries of why it needs to happen and what that would accomplish. And hopefully, first of all, I should say Audubon is a nonpartisan organization. It does not endorse one particular candidate for elected office. That said, some candidates align better with our policies than others. And likewise, we have not seen a lot of progress, I'll say, with a Republican Senate. And if the Senate goes to the Democrats, then I think we will see a 30 by 30 resolution get passed out of the Senate. If it stays with the Republicans, we won't. But with a Biden administration, we're still likely to see administrative action on 30 by 30. So that'll be something. So I talked a little bit about the current levels of protection that are out there. Globally, the estimate according to the Protected Planet Report was 15% of all land globally has been protected, about 16% of territorial waters. They note that only 20% of key biodiversity areas that have been identified globally are under some kind of long-term permanent protection. And I'll describe a little bit about what we mean when we talk about protection in a moment. In California, the estimate that we've been working under is about 22% of the state's land is under some form of permanent protection, and about 15% of our waters. But one of the key areas, and this is really a problem globally, but we've definitely identified it in the state of California, we actually, for all our technological prowess in the state and all our resources, haven't done a very good job of mapping and understanding our ecosystems. And so there needs to be a very significant investment in that for us to understand how to even protect all these areas. So when I talk about getting to 30 by 30 in California, I'm not talking about starting from zero. I'm talking about protecting another 8% of our lands and roughly another 15% of our state and federal waters. And so that maybe makes it seem a little more achievable as we work towards that goal, because otherwise it could be quite daunting. So defining protected, there's a lot. I'm going to break the rules of good presentations by putting too many words on sometimes, but you can read that definition for yourself, and then I'll kind of step through some of these in a moment. But Jeanette, did you have your hand up? I can't hear you though.
What about the wildfires? They make the habitat change completely, but does it still get to count as part of the 30-30?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question actually about how do we count and why do we count what we count? And you can see here, there's about 6 or 7 areas. There's kind of a hierarchy of protections from the highest to the lowest. The first being like a strict nature reserve, where it might be completely exclusive, like nobody goes there because it's too sensitive, and there's very few areas that are like that in the state. And then you have things like wilderness areas, national wildlife refuges, all the way down to a protected area where natural resource extraction is allowed. And that may include like a permanent easement, for example. And a lot of federal lands, like federal forests, have forestry and grazing. But some of the question about, let me answer your question in 2 ways. The first is, yes, if say we have a national monument that's protected, which is forested, even if that all burns down, it's considered part of the protected land mass. Now it has to be managed in order to be ecologically functional and safe, but forests will eventually burn, so that there has to be some balance there. But what we want to be careful about in designating protected areas is that if we're a little too loose with the definition of protection, like on this lower end of protected areas with sustainable use, if we call every park a protected area, then we're not actually going to protect enough land or water to preserve the ecological functions. That's the fundamental purpose for why we're doing this whole exercise in the first place, right? So, and you can think about an example in the Bay Area. If we went out and called, I was just out there, the Miller Knox, shoreline that's in Richmond. I was out there with my family last month, taking a walk along the shoreline. Now, if we designated that like as a really full protected area, but it has very heavy use and it's highly modified as a park, then we're probably not going to get the ecological function that we need in the 30-30 context. And so there has to be a balance. And likewise, if you protect a very actively logged forest that's there primarily for extraction, then you're not going to get the ecological function of the forest either. So that's the tension that we're going to have as we start creating different designations of protections for different areas. So we struggled a little bit with this definition of protection when Audubon, Defenders of Wildlife, Azul, and the Natural Resources Defense Council introduced legislation in the California State Legislature earlier this year to protect 30% of nature in California, to make it the goal of the state of California to protect 30% of its nature. And so this bill was introduced by Assemblymember Ash Kalra from Santa Clara. If you've been following Audubon, you may know that Ash Kalra was the author of AB 454 in 2019, which protected migratory birds in California, despite the rollbacks by the Trump administration of federal migratory bird protections. And so I just want to really kind of do a shout out to Assemblymember Kalra, because for 2 years running, he really stepped up to be an environmental leader. He's from the Bay Area, from Santa Clara, and the bill that we wrote with him, AB 454 last year, was the only kind of its type across the country to protect migratory birds in the face of the Trump administration's rollbacks. And he did that, and we got it passed, and the governor signed it. This year, he stepped up to do it 30 by 30. And the elements of that were to ensure that we got enduring measures that supported biodiversity, climate resilience, ecosystem function, and access to nature for current and future generations. And I circled this because this brings me back to my point that I started earlier on about, like, it's not about just taking lands and walling them off from people. It's really about figuring out, as we conserve and protect nature, how do we do that in a way that integrates and and protects communities and benefits communities. And arguably even more important at this point, I think in our history, how do we begin to address the historical inequities that have deprived many people, especially communities of color and especially disadvantaged communities, that have deprived them of the access to the benefits of nature? And by that, I mean, they often don't have green spaces in communities, and I'm going to talk a little more about this. Communities of color and disadvantaged communities often suffer disparate impacts or higher impacts from things like air pollution, lack of clean water, heat effects, all myriad of effects. And so the 30 by 30, we saw that when we drafted AB 3030 this year, was an opportunity to start to address some of those historical inequities. So in general, when people start talking about 30 by 30, whether it's the international or the national or the state level, there's a general approach that you will see in each of these elements. And I wanted to flag this for you guys, because I know many of you guys are engaged with other local and state organizations. You may be even engaged with how your cities or counties began to grapple with 30 by 30. And there's no reason why the city of Berkeley or Alameda County or Contra Costa County could not adopt a 30 by 30 approach itself. And there's generally kind of some steps that entities go through as they're grappling with how to approach it. And first and foremost, it's really an explicit declaration of the need and intent. And you'll see that in Senator Udall's bill if you check out Senate Resolution 372. Is you have to just acknowledge why we need to do this in the first place and how people will benefit in the long term. Another thing that's really been emergent, especially at the global scale, but nationally and in the state we've identified this, has been an acknowledgement of the experience and the sovereignty of indigenous people around the world, many of whom who have been displaced, often violently, as here in California, but this is a global experience, and who have been marginalized often from conservation and land use decisions. And so again, 30 by 30 is an opportunity to recognize the authority in California of sovereign tribes and their experience, and seek to do a peer-to-peer between the state of California and the tribes, for example, to be treating them with the respect due to their sovereign nation status that they have. Again, also, you'll see this globally. We were very careful to craft this in California, a recognition of the equitable benefits of nature, which I touched on. Also, a commitment to science, collecting data, analyzing it, using that ultimately to prioritize areas, to prioritize the diversity of habitats. Usually it comes with some degree of, and how do we incentivize conservation, whether it's through market programs or things like easements? How do we disincentivize poor conservation choices? And then making sure there's sort of a transparent stakeholder process. So all that brings us to the state of California. What happened with AB 3030 this year, the bill that we worked on, is it got to the assembly on a strong vote. It went to the state Senate. We got through the policy committees in the state Senate, but then it went to the Appropriations Committee. And the Appropriations Committee in the Senate looks at the fiscal costs associated with any proposed piece of legislation. And with the sort of economic downturn, to put it lightly, that we experienced this year, this was not a good year for expensive bills to get out of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And so the Senate Appropriations Committee decided this bill was too expensive to go forward this year, and they held it. So it never went to a floor vote in the Senate. And so our bill, AB 3030, for all intents and purposes, died in the Senate this year because of the costs associated with it. But we kept up our advocacy and really do credit to colleagues like Defenders of Wildlife and some others, and to Secretary of Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot, who is the lead for environmental programs here in the state. They carried this to the governor, and in October, early October, the governor issued this executive order in 8220. And it covers a wide variety of ecological issues. So it covers the need for the state to protect biodiversity, the need for the state to generate some solutions that relate to our natural and working lands, which I'll talk about a little more in a moment. It committed the state to a 30 by 30 strategy, developing one. And then it reinforced throughout the executive order the need for California to build resilience to climate change, both for people and our biodiversity together. And the benefits of nature for all, so that we're providing, really addressing the inequities that have persisted too long in California as we execute a really aggressive conservation strategy. So we're very excited to get the executive order. We'll be more excited if the governor pays for it and puts it in his budget, which we will see in January, because it's relatively easy to make commitments in an executive order. It's a lot harder to pay for them. And natural resource spending in California has basically been flat for about 20 years, even as our state's budget has increased. So for all intents and purposes, we're really putting less into natural resources than we were 20 years ago in the state, even as our ecological challenges have grown. And there's a lot of important priorities in the state with education and homelessness and healthcare. So we understand that, but there also needs to be investments in natural resource and access to nature for everybody. I'm going to step through the executive order because I think this really brings a lot of the work home and gives us a way to think and talk about how we might get engaged. So the first sort of strong element that we see in the executive order was a commitment to work on and protect biodiversity throughout the state. The governor established a biodiversity collaborative of key state agencies, as well as working with tribes, local governments, the federal government when it's amenable, and NGOs like Audubon and the Nature Conservancy and other stakeholders. And so this collaborative is supposed to come together, bring together the data and the key stakeholders in order to make decisions about how we can basically have a biodiversity initiative in the state. Throughout it, as I mentioned, it focused on climate resilience, but specifically in this case, climate resilience for sensitive species and our biodiversity, which will change significantly over the next century. A commitment to really analyze and inventory the biodiversity in the state. You know, we know that there's, we have rough inventories of, for example, the number of native plants or the number of native birds that appear in the state. We actually do not have very good data about where all those occur, and not very good data about to make projections about how they may change with climate change. In order for us to make good, smart decisions about climate change and where we want to make investments, we need to understand what's out there already. It also commits to expanding education around biodiversity, how important it is and its benefits, and to advance multiple benefit projects. And so when I talk about multiple benefit projects, think of, we talk about groundwater recharge, for example, which is really important. Well, we don't want to just recharge groundwater. We can also use that as a wetland that provides habitat. And that wetland can also provide a green space for adjacent communities to go out and hike in or see birds. And it could also provide flood control. So that's a multiple benefit project, and we're looking for multiple wins we can get from major projects that benefit nature. The next is that the executive order delivers on, or promises to deliver on, is natural and working lands climate solutions. So if you have been following efforts to get climate change under control globally or in the state, a lot of our attention has been focused on reducing emissions. And we've made our major investments in reducing emissions from industry, like refineries, or from cars, getting cleaner cars on the road and incentivizing people to drive less. And those areas, transportation and industry, are major polluters. But the working lands, like cattle, is also a major polluter. And but more importantly, we know that well-managed natural lands, so parks, forests, open space, and well-managed working lands like farms or rangelands or ranches, if those things are managed well, they can actually sequester a ton of carbon. And they can pull that carbon out of the air, and they can hold it in the ground, and they can reduce the overall presence in the atmosphere and help us keep global temperatures from rising too much. California has been a leader in implementing climate solutions. It has lagged in natural and working lands climate solutions. We've been so focused on the emitter side, on transportation and industry, that we haven't been investing in how to make natural working lands work for us. And so we have been trying, Audubon and our colleagues at Nature Conservancy and TNC and Defenders and many others have been trying to get the state to focus on this for years. Now with this executive order, we have a directive from the governor telling the key agencies that work on climate change that they must develop standards for natural working lands investments in order to reduce emissions, secure carbon. And there's a ton of other benefits that come from this strategy, and I'll just give you a couple examples. We know, for example, that well-managed rangeland, so land like oak woodland, grassland that has cows on it, not only if you manage that well to reduce emissions from the cattle, so you have fewer cattle spread out over more time, you see a biodiversity spike that goes through the roof for native plants and native birds. They come back to areas that are well managed. Also, the soil health increases and captures more water, which is really important to ensure that our water supplies in the state, we maintain the level of water supplies that we need, which will be a challenge in the future. And that water tends to be cleaner. It gets filtered through more vegetation and the like. So we're not only securing more carbon in the roots of all the grass, but we're also providing more water capture and a lot of other benefits. And we can keep rangelands in operation and keep cattle out there in certain places. And while I'm not a big fan of the impacts that cattle have had on the West and our environment, I should acknowledge I'm a hypocrite because I eat beef, but also well-managed rangelands are much better than vineyards or Walmarts. And so there's an interest in keeping agricultural areas that are well-balanced in production. The other thing I'll just note is, as you'll see on the slide here, 75% of our state's lands are working or natural lands. So we have a huge, basically carbon bank or carbon sink that California can be leveraged to store carbon. You know, we talk a lot about the Amazon forest, and that's very important. It's really, we need to be making investments there, but we have a lot of capacity here in the state that could benefit from these investments as well. And I've been talking a lot about, you know, how California is tackling climate change. We have a goal based on SB 100 to get to 100% clean energy in the state by 2045. And, but also there's a goal that Governor Brown put out before he left office to get us to be zero emission or carbon neutral, I think by 2050. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us over the next 30 years to really clean up how the state operates. And natural and climate solutions are a big part of that. If you want to have a tree that's securing carbon, for example, you need to plant that tree today, or we should have planted it 20 years ago, so that it's big enough to be storing all that carbon. So we have to make the investments now if we want to see the benefits in 20 or 30 years. So I talked a lot already about sort of climate resilience or climate mitigation or mitigating it. And I'll talk a little bit about the wildfires here. The executive order again and again goes back to talking about how we need to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. And, you know, I should have, and I didn't include this on the bullet, but I'll make mention of it. You know, there's a lot of reports, many of you are probably familiar with the impacts that we expect from sea level rise in the Bay Area. And we're talking about just billions upon billions of dollars of potential impacts and properties being flooded. And California needs to come up with a plan to be more resilient to things like flooding or high sea level rise, but also wildfires. And so this executive order basically tries to set up that, you know, really set that as the policy of the state. And let me see, I've got here. So and I can transition a little bit to talk about fires here. So this year we had 4.2 million acres burn in 2020. The 5-year average is roughly 300,000 acres a year. So we had quite a bit more that burned this year than we typically have. And the expectation is that we will see we will see 2020 more often in the future, that we're going to have more fires, they'll be more frequent, they'll be more intense, and sort of cataclysmic. There's a loss of human life, there's a loss of property. All of that carbon that's being stored in those trees is getting burned up and released back out into the atmosphere. So we're doing all these efforts to control climate change, and yet we're releasing all these emissions as these fires occur. We were talking, Jeanette and I talked a bit about what are the impacts on birds. And, you know, I'll say for Audubon California, from a policy perspective, we've been focused sort of more holistically on the impacts of wildfire. Impacts of fire itself on birds, it's a little up in the air. You're certainly losing a lot of habitat, Birds tend to be mobile. They can fly away, though they often get caught up and burned. It's really the overall habitat loss. But we do know that it affected migration patterns this year, that birds either moved too quickly and moved out of the fire zones. Many of them died as a result because they were unable to feed the way they needed to during their migration. And we also know that it can have an impact on young birds that aren't yet able to fly out of these kind of zones. But without getting too deep into the politics of fire, at least on the ecological side, we should acknowledge that California for millennia burned with low intensity fires very frequently. And this brings me back to a point that I made earlier about really listening to and engaging with indigenous people in California. California was occupied for at least over 10,000 years, over 12,000 years, depending on who you ask, maybe up to 25,000 years before Spanish colonialists came in and began displacing indigenous people. Native Californians, Native Indians in California frequently used fire. They actively managed their ecoscape, their environment, for where they got food, where they got medicines, moving throughout the year. And fire was an active part of that. And so the ecology in California has shifted to react to that kind of fire. And what we've done, particularly in the last 100, 150 years, is completely suppress all of that. And that's been based in large part, one, on our extractive nature in which we've interacted with the land. Like, we're just going to go forest. We're just going to go log this forest, and that's all we're going to do. We're not going to manage it. Or we've suppressed fire because we've seen it as a pest and we haven't listened to the lessons of the past. And so we have to just acknowledge that and figure out how we can try to get back to some kind of balance. The other thing I will say on it is, what's clear in California is that we need real comprehensive vegetation and land use planning on how we live and move and develop in the state. So the tension right now that Audubon and many other environmental organizations are struggling with is the state has a vegetation management plan to reduce fire. We acknowledge we need to do that to protect people and property, to reduce emissions, protect habitats. But it can't just be creating fire breaks and thinning forests and like moving vegetation and habitat out like that. Those are all part of it. But we also have to stop building in higher fire zones. We have to be protecting sensitive habitat areas. And this is especially true in coastal sage scrub in Southern California, where developers, especially under the Trump administration, were chomping at the bit to get in and start building into coastal sage scrub, a highly endangered habitat that also burns. And they build these huge tract homes, they sprawl into them, and then they require more vegetation to be removed to protect those huge tract homes. That's not a good way to meet California's housing crisis. We need to be doing more infill and less sort of interactions with those natural areas. And so that's the tension. Audubon can't be in a place where we say, don't do vegetation management. We need to do that, but we should be doing it in a way that listens to lessons of the past and also not exacerbating the problem by building into those areas. A couple other things I just wanted to flag for you, and might have some additional questions as we wrap up, is the California executive order talks about the California Department of Food and Agriculture taking action to reduce impacts on pollinators. You've probably heard of bee colony collapse and the like. It's past time for California to be frankly wrestling with how we use pesticides, neonicotinoids among others, and that's something Audubon's committed to engage on. It also to promote healthy soils, and the healthy soils really goes into that kind of regenerative, smarter rangeland management, like how we manage the grasslands in California, which are rapidly disappearing, and the birds and other animals along with them. And then a constant focus on the need for local, state, federal, and tribal partnerships in order to achieve what we need to do under this executive order. So I'm guessing I don't have to make this, I don't have to explain why it's important to close what I call the nature gap, or what's called the nature gap here. But I do want to talk a little bit about this before, because, I will tell you that even among Audubon, there are folks within our organization or some of our members that ask like, well, why, we're a bird conservation organization. Why are you talking about these issues related to equity or addressing historical inequities about the access of nature or benefits to nature? And the answers are pretty easy for me. There's the easiest answer, which is because it's right and just and humane to be thinking about issues related to equity and acknowledge the historic inequities. But that's a little easy. But I think we should acknowledge, where we're at today. And today, according to the report, The Nature Gap, which was put out by the Center for American Progress, among others, that people of color are 3 to 4 times more likely to live in nature-deprived areas, especially communities of color that are also identified as being low income. We know that the loss of nature and being nature deprived has negative consequences for people's health, their psychological health and their physical health and their well-being overall and their quality of life. And we also know that globally, and I think also in California, communities of color and disadvantaged communities and low-income communities disproportionately suffer from the impacts of climate change. And I can give you a few examples. Already in California, 1 million Californians do not have ready access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water. So 1 million today, 1 million Californians don't have access to clean drinking water, clean and safe drinking water. That number, if we don't tackle it, is going to grow with climate change as groundwater wells continue to go down, as pesticides and other things continue to contaminate them, as the water supplies lessen because our snowpack lessens. Like if we don't tackle those issues, then even more people are going to be suffering from lack of clean drinking water. Heat effects. So I understand it got pretty hot in Berkeley and in the East Bay over the last couple of months. I live in Davis now. I'm from Fresno. So those of us from the Central Valley are used to a little heat. We have air conditionings. My boss who lives in Berkeley, I was on a Zoom call with her and she looked like she was going to pass out. She does not have an air conditioner in Berkeley. And she's, she's a pretty well-resourced person. We know that the impacts from heat are going to grow in places like San Diego, Los Angeles. In San Luis Obispo, it hit 120 a couple of months ago. And nobody has air conditioners there. Some people can afford to get out, go buy portable ones. A lot of people can't, and they have to suffer through that, and they don't have other resources. So the impacts of increased heat due to climate change are going to hurt a lot of people. They're going to disproportionately hurt, especially low-income communities and those folks that can't afford to live in houses with big air conditioners. And we're going to see it in places like San Francisco and San Luis Obispo that traditionally did not have to deal with high heat. We also know, hang on, Jeanette, I'll answer you, or I'll get to you in a sec. We also know that traditionally, tribes have either been ignored or their contributions and experiences have been discounted in land use planning and how we make decisions around natural resources that relate either directly on their lands or adjacent to their lands and their resources. And I want to emphasize, I've circled this and I bolded it. Conservation organizations like Audubon have perpetuated these problems. Audubon has not been inclusive. Our membership continues to be predominantly white, predominantly older, and our leadership is predominantly white. It's almost completely, our board is. On my management team for Audubon California, we are the state office for National Audubon in the state. We're basically the state department for National Audubon. I'm on a 6-member management team of department heads, and we are all white. The only diversity is, ironically, I'm the only male. So for once in my life, I bring an element of diversity to a gathering of fellow conservation members. But what that means, it's not, about having just representation or about, having diverse candidates there. We lack a wide range of perspectives at many levels. And the whiteness of Audubon has acted actively to exclude others from participating. And also we've had a lot of blind spots about decisions we make, policies we weigh in on, how they impact communities. And so I feel I have a moral obligation to learn more, to learn to be better, to work to change my organization, and be listening to colleagues of color and from other communities that provide other perspectives. And we must do that, one, because it's right, two, because we will not be successful in our mission to protect and conserve natural resources and people if we don't have that. And that, if there's more than anything, if I leave you with that notion about where we're at with 30 by 30 and protection, that the opportunity for conservation and the environmental movement to really address the inequities that we've helped perpetuate in the past is now, and we can do that. And it's a lot of work ahead of us, but we can do it. But sorry, Jeanette, I know you waved your hand a little bit ago, so no worries?
No worries.
Okay. So the last thing I want to say on this, it's really worth looking at this report, the Nature Gap, put out by the Center for American Progress. There are opportunities to be closing this gap locally, in Berkeley, in El Cerrito, where I used to live, in Richmond, in San Francisco, in the counties. And if they're not aware, if your Parks Commission is not aware of this, if the staff isn't aware, they should be. They should have read this report, and they should be ready to answer questions about how they're going to try to address some of the concerns that are raised there. And if you're an Audubon member, don't let them off the hook. Ask Audubon about how it's doing. Yes, Carol. I can't hear you, Carol. I think you're still muted. I still can't hear you. One more time.
There
you go.
Okay. Hi. Thank you. I was thinking of the fire in Australia where that burned and burned and burned and burned, and we heard up to 1 billion animals were gone. How similar are our problems in California to what was happening there? Because there's a lot less population, and anyway, compare.
Yeah. As far as the impacts of fire itself, I haven't seen any direct population estimates on different elements of wildlife. So I'd have to kind of go back and look at that. I would expect that the impacts on local terrestrial life, so things like red-legged frogs and things that can't get out of the way of fire, but it does kind of bring up a good point about biodiversity and population health. In the United States, we have seen a 30% decline in total bird populations since 1970. So the report Smithsonian put out last year, the estimated decline in overall bird populations has been about 3 billion. And the expectation is that number will continue to decline until we reach some kind of equilibrium. When natural populations, for the most part, of wildlife evolve to go through kind of contractions, right? So a classic example actually is the tricolored blackbird, which is an endemic bird to California, that once upon a time probably had 3, 4, 5 million birds in a total population in the state. And they nest in colonies of anywhere from 1,000 birds to, at their peak, 100 or 200,000 birds would gather in a Central Valley wetland, and they would make their nests together and produce young. And early Spanish explorers actually described them thinking that they were wildfires because they would see the tricolored blackbirds rise up off the wetland and move together, kind of a murmuration of birds that was so thick you couldn't see the sky. Today, there's about 150, 160,000 tricolored blackbirds left in the state, which sounds like a lot. But that bird is now listed as endangered in California because ecologists have identified that it's at a tipping point, that if that number goes any lower, then the populations will begin to collapse. because what happens is it nests in a colonial structure, and then another bird comes along, like the night heron, for example, the black-crowned night heron. It finds a colony full of, say, 1,000 birds, and then it goes from nest to nest and eats all of them, and the whole colony collapses. That's a natural thing. But historically, tricolored blackbirds, like if one colony of 1,000 birds collapsed, well, you had another colony of 10,000 birds over there, and it survived, and the population could kind of contract and go over time. Now what we've seen is we've narrowed the populations of all these birds so small that it just takes like one or two cataclysmic events to kind of just push them over. And so, you know, I can't speak specifically to those, the impacts related to Australia, but what I can say is the more sort of massive stresses that we put on these species, the more we push them to that point of no return, where they just sort of collapse, or their populations become so fragmented that they're not connecting with each other anymore. And so ecologically, they basically, you know, move towards extinction. Bringing it back to 30 by 30, just to give you some examples of how Audubon has engaged, and we helped, as I mentioned, we helped author AB 3030 earlier this year. We've also been engaged with something called the state's Biodiversity Initiative, which started under Jerry Brown, which has now been captured in the Governor Newsom's recent executive order. And this is really about inventorying biodiversity throughout the state. And Audubon's really lucky. We have a bunch of members who like to do work for free, and they go out and count birds and report them to us and put them into national databases. And like, they like doing that more than anything else. Like as a policy and political person, I used to try to get my members to show up to a city council meeting to talk about an ecological thing. And it was like pulling teeth. But if I need 10 people to show up on a cold, rainy day to count birds at the Berkeley Marina, I will get 40 people that I don't know what to do with. So Audubon can at least deliver some nerds to count birds, and I count myself among them. And so we can contribute to science, community-based science, in a way that we're really proud of. And so we're working on that. The other thing that's exciting that we've been working on is cutting the green tape. I don't know if any of you are involved with organizations that do habitat restoration. It could be urban creeks or shoreline groups. It is really hard to get all the permits and do all the planning and do all the environmental compliance. In fact, 1/3 up, maybe sometimes 1/2 almost of a budget to get a project done is just on the planning and permitting. And we can't achieve the scale and scope of restoration that we need to do in the state if that continues to be the model. And so it is a high priority of Audubon and other organizations like Nature Conservancy and American Rivers to reduce that. And Secretary Wade Crowfoot, head of natural resources here in the state, has made this one of the pillars of his time in the Newsom administration. I'm very much hoping that Wade does not get poached, so to speak, to go work at the Department of Interior under a Biden administration. But he might. We might see some real brain drain here in the state. But if he leaves, we will continue this initiative. And then because I work for National Audubon, I have the privilege of really being able to work on this 30 by 30 at the federal level, whether it's Senator Udall's resolution, or if he becomes Secretary Udall, what we see happen at the Department of the Interior. And I have international colleagues, both in Mexico and South America and in Canada, that also want to work on this. So Audubon is trying to leverage our international presence the same way Nature Conservancy and some others are, to be engaged in 30 by 30, again, in the same way that some groups are engaged on the climate talks at an international level. And I'll say that for each of these, a lot of other organizations like Defenders of Wildlife and NRDC, Azul, Latino Outdoors have been engaged in almost all of these things too. So this is a collective effort many of us are making. I did want to identify what we decided. I work with two really great colleagues in our policy shop here in California. I work with Juan Altamirano, who is he's the Associate Director of Public Policy, and he really is our lead on government affairs at this point. He knows everybody in the Newsom administration, he knows agency heads, he's a lobbyist, And he comes actually from more of a social justice background. And I work with Pedro Hernandez, who is our community outreach manager for climate. And Pedro comes from working on clean water and environmental justice issues in the Central Valley. And together, the three of us decided that we wanted to establish some core values about how we engage on 30 by 30 and be very explicit and commit and be transparent and accountable to hold up these values. And we wanted to set those out for Audubon California. And our hope is that National Audubon will adopt these as well. But that we lead with the notion that any of the benefits that accrue from 30 by 30 are really designated to provide benefits to everybody, not just a select few that can get on a river cruise boat to go up a river or to fly out to the Songus National Forest to see the forest, but that we are thinking about it in a holistic way, that in an equitable way to provide those benefits. That also that those benefits are durable, that we're gonna have permanent easements and permanent protections. And as I mentioned, really connecting issues of that equity and biodiversity and resilience, these all go together. They're not just separate buckets, but we don't make progress really on one if we're not making progress on all. To revisit this notion of the respect due to tribes, to be listening to what they have to say and respecting them as sovereign nations. And to prevent greenwashing. So a big organization like Audubon, this is always a threat that we're trying to be friends with everybody. We work with corporations, we work with Republicans at times that frankly aren't really interested in conservation. They just they have some other means to an end. And so we need to be authentic about our engagement, that we're not just being used to make someone look good if they're not really delivering on the promise of conservation and protection. And then to see 30 by 30 as an opportunity that grows engagement for everybody. It's not just a chance for Audubon to get more members and more donations, that this is a tide for all boats. And hopefully as you guys, again, if you're thinking about this for your organization or other organizations you're involved in, I recommend, as you start to get involved in an initiative like this, to be thinking about well, why are we doing this? And how are we going to talk to people about how we do it? In the state of California, we have a lot of opportunities to engage. Audubon is especially lucky. We have a broad membership that does these kind of things. This is from our advocacy day this year. In the center right is Assembly Member Wendy Carrillo from Southern California, who's a great ally and friend of ours. And we put together a call with 5 or 6 of our members and talked to her about AB 3030 and several other bills. So we've been thinking, how do we do this? How does Audubon engage? And what we want to do is, Audubon's a conservation organization. We connect people with nature. We will continue to do that, but we want to make sure we're talking about it in a 30 by 30 framework. And here's just some of the ways that we'll be doing that, which is the science and education and outreach, advocacy, and this authentic allyship, I think is really important. And what I mean by authentic allyship is, it is very easy for a group like Nature Conservancy or Audubon to be on the stage next to a legislator or Governor Newsom for big environmental announcements. And what we need to do is get out of the way. So when a colleague from, say, an environmental justice organization or someone else comes up and says, hey, I want to push, this is what's important to me, that we're present for them on that issue, even if it's not exactly our issue, that we make it our issue and that we work together. And that also we don't make it about us. We're not always worried about our organizations being front and center, but we're lifting up other people that maybe haven't had that seat at the table. And it's not, patriarchal. It's really just about getting out of the way more often. And that can be harder than you think, especially for a donation-driven organization like Audubon that wants to be delivering to donors or be attracting new donors. And that can affect our bottom line. And if we're going to be authentically involved, we have to be willing to do that and to make space both in the public presence and in the economic space for others to be able to step up and take more leadership and have more capacity. And that'll be a challenge. It'll be interesting to see how Audubon grapples with that. So I thought I would end just talking a little bit about the national context. And it's funny, as I use this picture in a presentation I gave to some of our chapters on Saturday, and I prepared the presentation before obviously the decision came down Saturday morning, and it was very hard to focus on the presentation. No one on the call could focus on Saturday morning, I'll have to say. But clearly, this really represents, I think, not just in 30 by 30, but a divergence of approaches that we see in the US on issues related to the environment, not just conservation, but going back to the issues of clean air, clean water, and ready access to the benefits of nature for everybody. And we have to make decisions how we're going to work and align our policies, and also how we're going to acknowledge for a group like Audubon that works in the conservation space that there are a lot of very serious consequences and activities well beyond just whether or not the white-crowned sparrow continues to persist in San Francisco. And Audubon needs to be humble and acknowledge that, both for our staff and our members that deal with a lot of the social pressures, I think, that have come about by, frankly, increased racism and policies that disproportionately harm people of color and rhetoric. We have a role. We have to be acknowledged and acknowledge that space that we're working in, and also decide how we work, frankly, with these two different sets of interests. And we haven't fully made, Audubon hasn't quite figured that out. It likes to bill itself as a centrist, bipartisan organization. And it's easy for me in California to be like, well, we're pretty partisan, because if you care about the environment, it's the Democrats that are voting for it. But I have colleagues that work in Texas and Georgia and Florida and South Carolina and Montana, and they don't have the convenience that I do and the kind of privilege I do to be, having one party that's going to necessarily vote your way. So I just want to acknowledge that that's quite a struggle. That said, even if this is not yet acknowledged from the White House or on Fox News, just about everybody else, including former President Bush, has acknowledged that Joe Biden won the election. And that's going to mean a lot for how we do our work on the environment, among many other areas, over the next 4 years. And we're already planning, before the election, we had transition documents that we're thinking about. And I don't know if you saw the news, but I think in the last day or two, certainly in the New York Times, it led with something like, the Biden transition team is already looking at 100 different rollbacks that the Trump administration did of Obama era health and environmental rules, that the Biden wants to come in and undo all of those. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us, frankly, just to undo the rollbacks that happened over the last 4 years. And then also, and 30 by 30 really captures this, we don't have time just to fix the mistakes of the past. We have to be making active investments in order to get to 30 by 30 or 50 by 50 or zero emissions. That takes real work now. But I do think the last point I wanted to make on this was, and this is where Audubon is committed, we know to make durable conservation results, we also have to be kind of winning some hearts and minds of folks that might have supported Donald Trump or, be voting in the red states, so to speak. And we have to be creative in how we engage people and show them it's in their self-interest and their community's interest to be engaging on things like 30 by 30. And that means hunters care about being able to have areas to hunt and waterfowl to hunt and what the populations are. Fishermen care about where they can fish and how they're going to access areas to fish sustainably. Ranchers care about whether they can afford to continue to ranch and how that's going to work. So that's a balance we have to kind of strike, even with the transition of Joe Biden coming in as president. I feel like I've talked for a very long time now. Hopefully no one's fallen asleep, which happened, I think, as I said, the last time I talked to you guys about wind turbines. I'll just lay it out, and I'm happy to go into this more some other time, but these are the major policy agendas that we've set forward for ourselves in Audubon, California. really engaging on climate change in many of the ways I've talked about, protecting and creating resilience for lands and water and people, and really as an articulate pillar of our work, expanding access to the benefits of nature for everybody. And hopefully, if you have me back, I'll be able to report on progress on some of these. So I kind of put some prompt questions in there, but I'm really happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen so we can see folks, and I can see the chat if you're too shy to say anything on screen.
I was going to just say one thing about one of the things that's sort of important to me is Mono Lake and the birds flyways there. And I had heard recently from the Mono Lake Committee that the LA Water and Power is bulking on continuing the agreed upon legal settings. Do you have info on that sort of thing?
You know, I heard a little bit about that, and I have to go back. There was a question around whether LWVBAE was allowing water basically to flow in some wetlands that were adjacent to Mono Lake. It wasn't necessarily Mono Lake itself. My understanding is they have to maintain Mono Lake under the litigation that occurred in the early 1980s to save Mono Lake, which National Audubon was part of, among others. But I think that at least I know that there was real concern about the flows of water that were going into some wetlands that were adjacent there and having some real impacts on birds and some other wildlife. So I'd have to go back and find out specifically what that's about. I would not be surprised. You know, LWVBAE they're like the Empire in the Star Wars movies. Like, they're an excellent villain, and they keep coming back and building Death Stars that you have to blow up. So.
Yeah, I figured they may be considering that this being a drought year, that they can just take more water.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you though, it goes to a good point. You know, I work on the Salton Sea as well, and I work on Klamath and Central Valley wetlands.
Yeah, Klamath, yes.
And it's always about water, water, water. And having grown up in Fresno and, you know, in a heavy ag area, and I know that the demands of agriculture and frankly, the political power of agriculture is still very strong. And we know with climate change, all that available water, the amount of available water is going to decline. And I don't know if you guys have been following this, but about 5 years ago, California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So prior to that in California, there was no regulation on how much groundwater you could use. If you could dig a well deep enough, you could use every drop that you could suck out of the ground. And in some places in the Central Valley, the ground has subsided by 10, 20 feet. And it's sort of collapsed because we've drained those aquifers. So it's getting harder to drain groundwater. That resulted in a lot of communities where people are living, losing their community wells and running out of water, or their wells being contaminated from infiltration, mostly from pesticides and fertilizers and things. And so that's part of the reason a lot of people don't have clean drinking water in the state. So not only are we likely to lose snowpack and available surface water due to climate change, we have less groundwater, and we have no way to rapidly refill our aquifers. So we're looking at a future where water stress is more real in California, as we also look at a time when our population is expected to continue to climb. And so just that notion, like, we have to be vigilant around things like Mono Lake, because the political pressures to pull water away from the environment are going to be extreme. And, you know, we have 3 major sources or so in the state around our water, and the San Joaquin Valley, or the San Joaquin River, the Sacramento, and the Colorado River. California gets more water out of the Colorado River than any other state. Most of that goes to the Imperial Irrigation District, which kind of sells it off to a bunch of people. And they're looking at very drastic cuts on the Colorado too, as they see less and less snowpack in the upper Colorado, and those southern states are needing more water for their growing populations. So yeah, if I really wanted to cash in, I would go into water law and carve myself out a niche there, but I don't think I have the constitution for it. So I'll stick with birds.
Well, I think in a way, what you're talking about emphasizes how it is that the state of California is actually not all blue, not all red. It is
Yeah.
kind of like the rest of the country. It has a great amount of diversity within it.
Yeah, again, I mean, I remember I went to school at UC Davis, and I remember coming, and then I worked at the Point Reyes Bird Observatory in West Marin, and for many years in the 90s. And I remember when Clinton was in office, going back to Fresno, and I remember I had left my parents' house and I was getting on Highway 99 to head north to go back home, and I remember seeing an "Impeach Clinton" sign, bumper sticker on the guy's car in front of me, and the C was a sickle, like a Soviet sickle, like Bill Clinton was a communist, like a Soviet communist several years after the Soviet Union had fallen. Like, that's how much this guy hated Clinton. and you know, it was a reminder as I went back to my little enclave in West Marin that you know, there's a real diversity of thought. And most of my friends that I grew up with are Republicans, right? And they're lovely people. We disagree pretty strongly on politics, but you know, California is much more purple than people give it credit for, and that's actually a real problem with how those blue-red maps go out. There's a lot of study that, like, you tend to write off Texas as red, and it's not that red. It's pretty purple. And you know, Georgia threw everybody for a surprise, or you know, came out of and turned blue on the presidential map, but it's been purple for a while and ready to go. It could go one way or the other. So it's a good lesson that we also have to listen to each other and humanize a bit. I think I appreciated that Biden brought that up on Saturday. It was like, you know, to move past the demonization and realize we're neighbors. Yeah, Ruby. Oh, you're muted though, Ruby.
So, you know, our organization too, trying to be more cognizant of diversity, less fortunate parts of the population. But our shtick is not going out to the harbor and counting birds. We're supposed to be lobbying, although lately we haven't been doing too successfully. So maybe you could give us some ideas about what you think we can do in this project that Audubon is undertaking.
So on the 30 by 30, you mean? Well, there's lots of different ways I think that folks could choose to get involved. So, and I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar, like the kind of lobbying or advocacy. Are you guys? Have you in the past, for example, had meetings with your state assembly members and senators? So, you know, and I don't know, you know, if you put together sort of what your agenda is or goal is for a particular year, you know, for example, the state budget comes out, a draft budget comes out in January. And what a group like Audubon at the state level does is we look at that, we say, like, what do we like? What do we not like? We talk to colleagues and ally organizations. We try to come together with sort of a shared agenda. And then we kind of set our lobbyists loose and we bring together our advocates to advocate on specific pieces. So for example, last year, as the budget talks went on and the governor started talking about austerity measures, they were going to cut the Department of Fish and Wildlife by about $30 million from a specific fund that had been really like the core of a lot of conservation spending that had been done in the state for decades. The Department of Fish and Wildlife at the state of California is honestly, not exaggerating, at least $100 million a year underfunded for just what it's mandated to do. It's probably closer to 150 million. So they were going to take another 30 million from this, and we understand austerity had to come around, but we were like, is there any way we can protect this 30 million? And so our advocates, we put together calls and we reached out to the governor's office and to legislators and said, in the budget negotiations, please protect this for Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so what I'd say, if you're open to it, is looking at the budget, for example, and when it comes out in January, and deciding, are there elements of this budget that matter to us on whatever agenda you guys have set for 2021? And I know your interest is well beyond the environment, so it may be related to education or, healthcare or a lot of other aspects. And then, put together that call with Senator Skinner, as I know in the area and many others, and meet with their office. It's as easy as like one of you deciding to call them up, set a date, and 2 or 3 or 5 of you getting together and saying, we want to talk to you about this today. And I'll tell you, in a lot of ways, it's easier to do it now than it was last year, because now all the offices do Zoom calls and they're happy to do it. They weren't doing that. It used to be you had to get in your car and go to Sacramento, or get on the train and go to Sacramento to do it. So I'd say, like, figure out what your agenda is, look at things like the budget. As new pieces of legislation come down, look at those and then decide how you can engage on it. The other really strong one is, like, who are your ally organizations? Can you get together and talk? And are they letting you know, hey, there's a piece of legislation we're really worried about. We can all gather around it and advance it. But just don't be, I guess the number one piece of advice is, don't be intimidated about calling the office of your local legislator and asking for a meeting just to give them a piece of your mind. They need to hear from you, and it makes a big difference.
Sounds good.
If you need more help on it on the back end, send me an email and I'm happy to help.
Okay, we'll take you up on that.
I think Ruby just sent us out a list of things that the California State League sent down for us to look over for the next year, right?
There you go.
Yeah, we're always doing that, actually.
Yeah.
And the Bay Area Leagues interview legislatures every year in the state and national. They do set up group meetings.
Okay, great.
On various topics, at least we used to. I assume we're still doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, just real quick, Carol, I will say, like, if I piqued your interest with a 30 by 30, I think one thing to keep an eye on for next year is the Newsom administration investing in natural resources? Like, given the reality of the budget austerity that we need to have to try to be fiscally smart in the state, are we making the investments in the things that the governor outlined in the executive order as sort of must-do actions? So where are we at in investing in biodiversity? Where are we at in making sure people can do the natural working lands climate solutions? Like, the budget should identify positions that are going to do that work. And so making that clear to the governor's office when you meet them, or your local legislators, to say, like, well, this is all it's all nice on paper, but it doesn't matter if there's not a person that's going to show up and do the work. And so that's, thinking about that and looking at the budget and saying whether you're satisfied with that, and frankly, calling people out. Like, that goes to the greenwashing thing. I mean, Governor Newsom's got kind of a checkered past on the environment, and we're very happy he did the executive order, but it's not a free pass to just put it in paper and not execute on it. Sorry, Carol, go ahead.
No, thank you. Well, sort of two interconnected questions. One has to do with the fracking and the usage of water. And that ties in with my understanding from talking to legislatures in past years that even with an entirely Democratic House, Assembly, Senate, and governorship, that the oil and gas, the carbon lobby is enormously powerful in California. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and it's interesting on the fracking thing. That was there was some real movement or discussion around that right when I came to Audubon, California, under Governor Brown, who was really okay like letting fracking go on some elements, because they had sort of been sold a bill of goods like, well, natural gas is better if we're trying to reduce emissions. Natural gas is better than some other than petroleum, for example. Overall on the fracking, they haven't made a lot of progress in the state, and that's kind of, I will say they've kind of stopped talking about that. And I think the notion that we need to get to zero emission, and the fact that fracking, frankly, hasn't really played out like they thought it would. Like, I don't know that it's, I mean, I'm not an expert in it. Sierra Club and others have engaged more, but I don't know that they're going to make a lot of progress, at least on state lands. And I think under the Biden administration, I don't think they're going to make very much progress on the federal lands, except for any leases. And we have to be vigilant of this, that Secretary Bernhardt pushes out the door before January 20th. I don't know if you guys know this, but David Bernhardt, who's the Secretary of Interior under President Trump, is a lobbyist for the Westlands Irrigation District, probably the worst water actor and anti-environmental entity in California, like worse than LWVBAE or the Metropolitan Water District. And he's in charge of the environment for the whole country and has been rapidly opening up areas to leases and expansion. So sorry, I kind of lost track there because I never miss a chance to rant about David Bernhardt. But I think that, so I can't talk much the specifics on the fracking, except that I don't think there's a lot of opposition to it in California. I don't think it's going to get a lot of momentum to go forward.
Yeah.
I'll say, on the renewable side, it's interesting that the tension that many of us that work on environmental conservation have is, I've talked about the wind pass at Altamont. There's emergent evidence around impacts from solar panels on birds. And we know that they have quite a bit of impacts just because they cover mass areas of land, like down in the desert. So trying to come up with a balance, we expect solar to expand in the Central Valley. And that might be a good thing because there's a lot of disturbed agricultural land that's coming out of production. So that's the best place to put those solar panels. But also, there is going to probably be a big push for offshore wind turbines in California, which can provide a lot of electricity around the clock, but we have no idea what the environmental impacts to offshore birds are going to be. Like, there's more birds offshore in California than there are in the state. We just don't see them. And so we have to be mindful of the impacts that are going to happen out there too. It's like, there's no perfect solutions.
So when you're talking about solar panels, you mean the large constellations of in desert lands, not on houses?
No, yeah, I think by the most part, the houses. The trick there, and Audubon has struggled with this, especially our membership. Like, well, can't we just why do we need industrial scale solar in East Alameda County or in the desert? And the fact of the matter is, we can't achieve our renewable energy goals just with rooftop solar. We're probably going to need industrial scale solar in some places. And it's not even like, even if we subsidized every house in California, well, there's a lot of houses and a lot of multifamily units that can't have solar on them because they're not built that way. And what we found, unfortunately, when the state was doing some subsidy for people's solar panels on their homes, is there's a lot of wealthy people that were using the subsidy to put it on their second home, or people that frankly didn't need the economic help to begin with. So we have to do a better job, again, going back to the equity issue, of like being deliberate about how we deliver benefits from these kind of programs.
Yeah. There's so much to keep up with, though, I think that.
Yeah, it's a
problem.
There's no end of it. And there's no, like I said, there's no real perfect solution to just about any of it. I can't, that's what I say. You get involved with water, and there's downsides everywhere. Like, you need water to grow food. Do you need that much water to grow the food? Do you need to grow that many almonds or, pomegranates or whatever the other thing is, or cattle, like how much water we put into cattle? And then if you say no, how do you do that with private land and all the other political considerations that are there? So.
Do we have any last questions from other people? Well, maybe we should end with thank you very much.